Welcome to the Ask Historians Podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians Podcast. Joining me today is Meg Hyland, a frequent contributor to Ask Historians, writing under the username KelpieCat. Meg is an ethnomusicologist and historian, specializing in women's work song in the Scottish fishing industry. She is currently enrolled in a PhD program in Celtic and Scottish Studies at the University of Edinburgh. Today, she'll be chatting with me about her current research, which focuses on what role music played in the working lives of women who worked as itinerant herring gatherers from the mid-19th to mid-20th centuries. Hello, Meg, and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm pretty excited.
It's always a pleasure. So, Meg, the first thing that I have to ask you is, what exactly were itinerant herring gatherers?
That is a good question because that is not necessarily going to be self-evident to everybody. So the herring industry was one of the biggest industries in Scotland in the period that I'm looking at, which, as Seb mentioned, is from the mid-19th to mid-20th centuries. At that time, herring were really abundant around the coasts of Britain and Ireland. And basically what happened was the fish would move seasonally. So they would be really abundant around the Western Isles of Scotland, which is the islands off the west coast, also known as the Hebrides. And there'd be lots of fish there around May. So fishermen from all over Scotland and to a lesser extent from England and Ireland and the Isle of Man as well, they would all go to the Hebrides to start the fishing season in May. And then they would follow the shoals of fish as they migrated first north towards the Northern Isles, and then south down the east coast of Scotland, and then the season would end in East Anglia in England around October to November. So you'd have the fishermen following the shoals that way, but you also had women who worked as herring gutters. So what their job was to travel to the ports before the fishermen would get there, and they would be ready at the port. When the fish were landed, they would immediately start gutting the fish and packing them into barrels. So they would salt them so they were preserved because a lot of them were exported to places like the Baltic. So these women, they were itinerant because, like the fishermen, they would leave their own home and travel to each port so they'd be ready to get the fish when they came. So that is what an itinerant herring gutter is.
That's very interesting, actually. Very, very interesting. And from what you've told me in our conversations, these women would sing work songs while working. But you've also mentioned that these songs are different from other Gaelic work songs. How so?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So first, they'll kind of lay out what I mean by saying they were singing while they were working. And then I'll talk about the Gaelic work songs and how they fit into those. So basically, gutting fish was done very quickly. Some of the women could gut up to 60 fish a minute, which is pretty amazing. That's one a second. Yeah, and they would even have competitions sometimes. Spectators would come and bet on which women could gut fish faster than the others, and so it was kind of competitive. But when you're doing something with a sharp knife that fast, it's really important to keep a consistent rhythm. And so what some women would do, quite a lot of them, is they would sing to coordinate the rhythms with each other because they'd have like a big wooden trough filled with the fish. And so you'd have several groups of women gathered around that gutting. And so you'd have like maybe 12 women all working at the same, they were called farlands, these troughs. And so it was really helpful to have their movements kind of coordinated because if you cut your fingers because the fish were being salted, that was going to be really painful. So you really wanted to avoid that. Basically, for my master's research, I looked at this phenomenon of women singing while they were gutting, and I was specifically looking at women who spoke Scottish Gaelic as their native language. For anybody who doesn't know, Scottish Gaelic is a Celtic language. It's very closely related to Irish, and it's definitely a minority language today with only about 60,000 speakers in the world. But at the time, it was still the community language of a lot of the places in the Hebrides where these women came from. And a lot of them actually learned English while they were working. So their native language was definitely Gaelic. And so the women from the Hebrides, who were disproportionately represented in the industry, there were a lot of them, they would sing in Gaelic while they were gutting. And what's interesting is that the Gaelic language has this really rich tradition of work song. So on the one hand, these women would have been very used to singing while working during activities like the most famous one is walking the Tweed. I'm told there's a scene of this in Outlander, though I haven't seen Outlander myself. So if anybody listening has watched that, they might recognize it. Basically, you have a group of women sitting around a table, and there's some cloth that they're trying to shrink to make tweed, and they're like pounding it against the table. And it's really important you keep the rhythm consistent because otherwise the cloth will shrink unevenly. So that's a lot of these women, they would have been used to doing that. They would have sung while they were milking. That was also considered kind of rhythmically important. And in Gaelic tradition, it said that like certain cows would have like their favorite song and they would only give milk if you sang that song. And they would have sung while churning butter, while doing like harvest activities. So basically, on the one hand, these songs really fit well into that tradition. But you asked about what's different from other work songs. And what's interesting is that these songs are much faster than most Gaelic work songs because the work they're doing is much faster. And so what you find when you look at the songs in detail in terms of their form and the lyrics is that they're actually drawing more from the dance song tradition. And in Gaelic, dance song is called Puirste Bíal, which means literally music out of the mouth. You'll hear it called mouth music. And a lot of different cultures have mouth music. It's basically like singing really quickly to accompany dancing. So the rhythm is more important than the lyrics usually. And you'll hear it called lilting in Irish. In Scotland, it's often called diddling. But in Gaelic, it's Puirste Bíal. And it's, like I said, it's much faster than other kinds of work song because you're dancing. And when you're gunning like one fish a second, it makes sense that you're going to have that much faster rhythm. So that's part of what's really interesting for these songs for me is they really combine the Gaelic work and dance song traditions, but in a way that makes sense because those traditions are ultimately related. Because when you think about work and dance and accompanying both of them with music, they're actually quite similar in the sense that they're both coordinating group movements and using music to do that. And the word for this in Gaelic is lúneach. And some scholars, like my supervisor, Will Lamb, as well as the late Gaelic scholar John McInnes, have argued that, like, really, with this word lúneach, the work and dance song were really not considered separate originally in Gaelic. And it's only kind of the later view of the ethnographer that makes them seem really separate. So the gutting songs, by being songs sung during work, but that are dance songs, kind of closes that circle. You know what I mean?
That's fascinating, actually, because one of the other things I was interested in asking you is specifically about the structural form of these songs when it comes to music theory, when it comes to analyzing the way in which the rhythm functions, in which the lyrics are designed either to work exactly into the rhythm or outside of it. So what can you tell me about that?
Okay, that's a good question. So that's one of the ways that you can tell they're more like dance songs than work songs, because basically with Puirste Bíal and with gutting songs, it's pretty simple structure. You have 4 lines of verse, which do have like lexical content, like their actual lyrics, although the subjects are often kind of nonsensical or whimsical or teasing. And then you have a 4-line chorus, which is made up of nonsense syllables, which have completely no lexical meaning. But in Gaelic song, non-lexical vocables, as they're called, are really important. So like in English, an example of a non-lexical vocable would be fa la 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 la, right? Or hey diddle diddle in The Cat and the Fiddle. So a lot of languages have these. But in Gaelic, they're really important for work song because they are unique to each song. And that's really important because the lyrics are often improvised in the verses, but the vocable refrain will always remain the same. And so you get that with these gutting songs too, because there's often like a core, like a lyrical core. So like one song always has the verse about the fish girl looking across the bay, waiting for her lover to come home. But then the verse is about her lover and what his job is and where he comes from. Those are all improvised. But there is that kind of core, and the vocable nonsense refrain is really important part of that.
And from what you're telling me, there are some certain important symbolisms in these songs that come from everyday life, that come from their interactions with the world in which they live in, and not just their work. So, what are some of these cultural conditionants and determinants?
Okay, that's a good question. So, basically, even though they're work songs because they're sung during work, the lyrics almost never refer to the work that they're doing. They rarely talk about gutting fish. Occasionally, they'll mention their employers as characters. Their employers were known as curers because the work they were doing was known as curing the fish. And so basically, the curer was the one who paid them their wages. And so occasionally, he'd show up as a character. But what the lyrics are really about is at their core, they're all improvised, teasing love songs. And that's really shaped by the background of the women singing them. So most herring gutters would have started work at the age of 14. Sometimes, occasionally, you would have women starting as young. They're not even women, girls starting as young as 10. But the norm was to start when you were about 14. And it was something that they really looked forward to because if you can imagine, you live in a small island, which you've never left before, but when you turn like 14, you get to go all over Scotland and maybe even Ireland and England and meet people from all over. There would have even sometimes been women working alongside them from Sweden and Norway. So it was a very international and cosmopolitan scene. So it was really something that they were excited about. And there's stories about they would even start singing while they were on the trains on their way to the port to be ready to meet the boats. So their age was a really important part of it because sometimes they'd be accompanied by their mothers, but often they were going without adult supervision for one of the first times in their lives. And as a social phenomenon, that has a precedent in Gaelic culture where before the fishing industry really took off, young women also would have gone away for the summers, but it would have been to the shieling, which is like kind of an out farm where you take the cattle for the summer grazing. And there's a whole thing in Gaelic poetry where basically when the young girls go to the shieling and the boys go to check on them, all sorts of shenanigans occur. So there was definitely kind of a social and cultural precedent for this kind of topic and this kind of music. But there were some differences because this was, for a lot of them, the first time they were working in a commercial environment. The only other time they might have worked for wages was if they worked as maids in like big houses. But for most of them, this would have been their first time in kind of a commercial venture compared to subsistence farming and fishing. And so what you get in these songs that's really interesting is hints of their economic aspirations. There's a real sense of excitement at the social mobility that working in this industry might provide them. So, for example, one thing you get the women singing a lot about in these songs is housing. The traditional house of the Hebrides, Untitled, the black house, would have been a turf house, sometimes with a window, but it would have been kind of all one room, and you would have kept the animals in there with you. And it was very suitable for life on a really windy island when you wanted to be protected from the elements. But it also didn't afford you a lot of privacy. And that's something that the women sing about. There's this one song where basically it's there's several verses with her and her boyfriend going back and forth, like, oh, well, maybe I can meet you at 4 behind the peat stack, or maybe we can meet behind the garden wall on Tuesday. Like, they're trying to figure out where to meet. And then when they finally hook up in the black house, the old woman comes in and, like, the grandma finds them in the act. And then she starts singing about how I don't want that kind of house anymore. And the kind of houses they did want were, they called it Untitled, the White House. And basically, you get all around Scotland. On the mainland, you started really getting this in the 18th century. If you imagine kind of like a picturesque Scottish cottage with like whitewashed stone walls, that's the kind of house they saw when, and they sing about it like na Tayangala sa Lerwick, the white houses in Lerwick, which is in Shetland. Like they sing songs about like, oh, we went and like saw these houses, and my boyfriend, he's going to build me a house with a floor, with stairs, with windows. And they often sing about how that'll help keep them clean and healthy. Now, I don't know if it's fair to the Black House to say it would have made you sicker, but I think there was this kind of sense of like, it was like a dirt floor and had the animals in there. So they were kind of feeling like, okay, now we're making money and we want to live in these nice houses like the ones we're seeing. And they would really spend money when they were traveling too. And it was a big deal to bring home souvenirs. So especially when they went to England, there was a whole market for souvenirs for Scottish herring gutters to bring back home. And so there was this real sense that they were kind of moving up in the world. And what's interesting is that in Gaelic literature, you kind of see the other side of it, where you get men in the mid 20th century writing about how stressful it is that their wives want them to build them nice houses now. So before I did this research, I had read that short story in my Gaelic class. It's called, I forget what it's called, but it's by a guy called Ian Morach. And he's basically saying, like, when I was a sailor, I made all these promises to her, but I still haven't recovered from fighting in the war, and so I can't finish building her this house, and she nags me, and so it's really interesting. That was my only perspective of architectural change in the Hebrides. But then when I started looking at these songs, I was like, well, it's kind of interesting. It doesn't devalue the pain that this guy felt, but it's really interesting to see that they weren't thinking of it as like this pressure thing. They were like really excited, like, my man and I are making some money now, like we can really do something and make something of ourselves. So that's I would say that's another one of the big factors, the economic situation influencing the lyrics.
I find that particularly interesting because I'm going to interject for a minute with my own research.
Mm-hmm.
Because Latin America doesn't really have a lot of work songs. That wasn't a tradition that we particularly inherited from Europe. That's probably related to the fact that Spain doesn't really have a very vast tradition of work songs, at least not when you compare it to other countries in Europe. Um, I mean, you have some Spanish work songs, mostly usually associated with farming, that were brought here and that influenced the development of a couple of Latin American folk styles. Like, well, the most popular one is usually called the corrido, which is mostly associated with Chile, but usually with Mexico. Um, Actually, these days, the corrido has evolved in Mexico, and it has become the narco corrido, which talks about the difficulties that the population faces when having to deal with the ever present threat of narco cartels. So the tradition in general of work songs didn't come here, but in folk, especially here in Argentina, we do see a lot of influences that very much relate to what you were telling me. Um, the idea, well, first of all, the idea of love is very much present in many songs and in many folkloric creations, but also the idea of housing and the idea of housing representing a certain sense of stability, or the opposite. For example, in many folkloric styles here in Argentina, you have, especially in the hinterlands where I live. Well, nowadays it's difficult to say if hinterlands still exist anywhere in the world, but let's say they do. Uh, for example, in my region, one of the most traditional dance and folk styles is called tonada, and many tonadas usually mention the lifestyle of the gaucho, our version of the cowboy, living in a rancho. A rancho is basically just wood, just a lot of wood with a dirt floor and just nothing more than a couple of walls and a very thin ceiling made of wood again. And they usually talk about their aspirations to actually have an adobe house. And so I find that this particular connection very interesting because there are a lot of songs here, and there's also a lot of tango in Buenos Aires, which is probably one of Argentina's largest exports outside of meat and football players. Um, oh, and the queen of the Netherlands. Uh, but in tango, there are also a lot of references to what we call a conventillo, which conventillos were very large houses in certain areas of Buenos Aires, usually very close to the port where most of the immigrants used to work, that were basically similar to boarding houses or to long houses, just enormous places where many families live together in very uh, in dreadful conditions. There's a lot of tango, particularly from the very beginning of the history of tango in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, that also talks about this idea of being able to afford getting out of the conventillo, getting out of that life, being able to afford their own apartment, their own house, their own, basically their own paradise outside of the hell they perceive their lives to be. So I find this very interesting.
That is really interesting because, like you said, on the one hand, it's very similar, but on the other hand, it's kind of opposite because the gutting songs. So, Gaelic song in general tends to be really negative about the cities of Scotland, especially Glasgow, because that is where most Hebrideans left for. For a lot of reasons that would take a long time to explain. The Hebrides were not in the best of economic circumstances in the 19th century because of the clearances. A lot of people were leaving for the cities, and generally that was portrayed negatively. But these women, their songs, part of what stands out about them is that they're so positive about wanting houses like they see in the more kind of urbanized, industrialized Scotland. Because what's interesting is that both the gutting songs and the tango songs you were talking about are being negative about the type of house they're used to. But the conventillo is like this urban, almost, you make it sound kind of like a tenement. Whereas the black house today is really romanticized. And is considered like, and not even in a negative way necessarily, but just like kind of the decline of the black house is really lamented in late 20th century writing from Gaels, because it's considered like this lost part of cultural heritage. And like if you go to the Hebrides, like when I was in Lewis, we got to see a reconstruction of a black house. So it's really interesting because it's like, from what you were saying, the conventillo have none of those kind of there's no kind of nostalgia for them in those
No, at
songs.
least not at the time. You see a sort of nostalgia today, to the point in which there's an entire neighborhood in Buenos Aires which is called San Telmo, one of the oldest neighborhoods in Buenos Aires, in which nowadays many of the conventillos there have been transformed into basically mini malls. In which you can go inside and you can see the apartments in which families used to live, and they are basically extremely expensive boutiques and tea shops and antiques shops. There's also a lot of antique shops there. So you see today sort of a nostalgic revival of what tango condemned as the worst place possible to live in the world.
Yeah, that's interesting. Whereas these they're kind of negative about the black houses, but more in the sense that they just feel they're outdated. Not that they've been forced into like bad conditions, you know what I mean? That's an interesting compare contrast.
Yeah, definitely. Well, there's also the very interesting contrast in which Many of the songs I'm talking about particularly were written by immigrants, not by people who actually lived already. Many of the early tango compositions were written by immigrants who had very recently arrived in Buenos Aires and were trying to get by in a city where many people were emigrating to in the late 19th century and the early 20th.
That's
So
almost,
there's also that
yeah.
difference.
That's almost more akin to like Irish American music. You know what I mean? Like the Boston Burglar and stuff like that, kind of about trying to adapt to American society, but Irish people are pressured into crime, that sort of thing. That's really interesting.
Okay, so now we have a special treat for our audience in this particular episode. When you come to the Ask Historians podcast, you don't expect the historian talking to sing to you, but Meg has told me in our pre-recording chat that she'd like to sing for us to showcase how exactly these songs sounded. So, tell us, Meg, what is this song you're going to sing called, and what can you tell us after you've sung it? Of course, what can you tell us about it, its lyrics and its symbolisms?
Okay, so this song in Gaelic is called Ir Tíreadóir Sir Múra Nocht, which means ashore last night, at sea tonight. This is a variant of the most common gutting song, and this is a song that may have existed in some form before the gutting, but has continued to have a life long after it. Anne Lauren Gillies, a Gaelic song scholar, wrote that she heard a version of it being sung about a Glasgow police officer instead of a fisherman. So basically, this song has a core, like I was talking about, but it's always improvised. And this version that I'm going to sing to you was composed by a gutter called Mary Morrison, or Mari Joen Voor. She was from Barra, one of the islands in the Hebrides, and she worked as a gutter in the 1920s. And so I'm going to sing you her verses, and then I'll tell you a little bit after about what they were about. So this should hopefully give you an idea of what these songs sounded like. Ir tíreadóir sa múran nach, ir tíreadóir sa múran nach, ir tíreadóir sa múran nach, after a stoch a lamsa, see o load a lady, see o load a lady, see o load a lady, see o Chatchich batan nach gumur, chatchich batan nach gumur, chatchich batan nach gumur, a gu ho fatan kianor, see o low a lady, see o low a lady, see o low a lady, see o so coril nian some Porsche, so coril nian some Porsche, so coril nian some Porsche, the co with Cassan Mountain sock, see o low a lady, see o low a lady, see o low a lady, see o Chanel Molan and Nana show, och Chanel Sevilla, noch Chanel Molan and Nana show, so Jamie Sussery Stanger, see o load lady, see o load lady, see o load lady, see o Kula setter mismo loy, Kula setter mismo loy, Kula setter mismo loy, Hakune ter mis mountain sock, see o load lady, see o load lady, see o load lady, see o Sound and drive ik hamoloy, sound and drive ik hamoloy, sound and drive ik hamoloy, san I ain't was margialiat, see o the load lady, see o the load lady, see o the load lady, see o San engine room a hamoloy, san engine room a hamoloy, san engine room a hamoloy, san I ain't was margialiat, see o the load lady, see o the load lady, see o the load lady, see o She de kanda hanam loy, she de kanda hanam loy, she de kanda hanam loy, san I ain't no say trankan. See o the loaded lady, see o the loaded lady, see o the loaded lady, see o Honey du gestaien ba, go chashari ech mogra. Honey du gestaien ba, she private ek McIver. See o the loaded lady, see o the loaded lady, see o the loaded lady, see o Fair weather gestaien ba, fair weather gestaien ba, fair weather gestaien ba. San Jerick so as me ek mountain sock. See o the loaded lady, see o the loaded lady, see o the loaded lady, see o Engine trouble lek moloi, briste shies and drumachun. Engine trouble lek moloi, san fi angel gu gangway. Sio diddle ladium, sio diddle ladium, sio diddle ladium, siodium, siodum. So gunechjen hin mograf, fieva gare rameskach. Ogunechjen hin mogra, nuchichkach is skreinkor. Sio diddle ladium, sio diddle ladium, sio diddle ladium, siodium, siodum. There you go.
That was great.
Thanks.
I that was very good and very interesting. I could hear the rhythmicality that you mentioned. It's very it's plain as day. This I mean I when I was listening to you, I could almost feel and I could almost imagine the movement of their hands doing this repetitive and very fast tasks over and over again.
And you can tell that it's also dance music because it's really hard not to kind of move along with it after a certain point. And that's part of why I sang the whole thing, because the longer you're in it, it's like you really can see how you would have gotten in the zone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That was a very interesting example. And what exactly do the lyrics mean?
So basically, she's singing about how her boyfriend is a fisherman and he's not going to be home tonight because he's out fishing, but she still won't take up with a stranger. And so she's singing about who, like, my darling is the best at dancing out the tune. We're separated by like a strait. The ocean is between us. And then, though it's interesting because those verses are pretty standard, but then Mary Morrison improvises a bunch of verses, which only exist in her version. So she starts singing about how he's in the engine room, and that's the line, "Sen engine room, aha maloi." So she's borrowed that word directly from English. She deckhand, aha namloi, he's a deckhand. And she keeps saying he can't come up because he's busy, they won't let him. And then this was interesting. So she sings about two different boats, and neither of them has a Gaelic name. So she says Honeydew is coming into the bay, and Fairweather is coming into the bay. And I happen to live in the same town as the Scottish Fisheries Museum. So I was able to do some research there with the fishing almanacs from the turn of the 20th century. Almanac. And there were only, when you combine those two boats together, this song has to have been, those verses have to have been composed after 1921 because those boats weren't both in service until then. And she even uses a Scots word. She says, when she says, Honeydew ystayam bach o hashadi ek mogra, that means the honeydew is coming into the bay. My boyfriend has a shoddy. And that's a Scots word meaning like a big catch of fish. But then she says, but it's privately owned by McIver. And Duncan McIver was the big curer from Stornoway. And so basically she's saying, like, my boyfriend's bringing in all this fish, but, it goes to the curer. He's not going to keep all the money. And then at the end, she just says, well, first she says his engine trouble is stopping him from coming home. But then she says, I would always know my boyfriend from others by the smile he wears. I would always know my boyfriend while all the rest look grumpy. And that's how she ends the song.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, that's what it's about. And it's really interesting because so the use of the Gaelic mixed with the English is something that's called Macaronic Verse. And it's pretty common in Irish music. You'll hear about it a lot. Like like the song Crushkin Lawn is Macaronic. The verses are in English, but the refrain's in Gaelic. But you don't hear about it as much. Gaelic song scholars haven't talked about it as much. But it's a sign, the words they're picking in English and Scots are all to do with the fishing industry. Engine trouble, the deckhand, engine room, and then the names of the boats, Honeydew and Fairweather, and also the word private, for private ownership, which is kind of interesting. And you also, it's kind of more widely indicative of how these songs were really cosmopolitan in their outlook, which, sometimes there can be a stereotype of like quote unquote ethnic music, that it's very kind of provincial in its worldview, like, oh, we're only focused on our local place where we lived since time immemorial. But they were really in these songs engaging with the world outside the Gaeltacht, which is the Gaelic speaking areas of Scotland. So one kind of funny difference in one of the songs, I think it's different, another version of this song, but it wasn't one of the verses that Mary Morrison used. They say, Hamo lenen asa vruach, ach han hajian mi suas ristrencher, which means my lover's from Fraserburgh, which is in the northeast of Scotland, but I wouldn't take up with a stranger. So in other words, like, boys from Fraserburgh are strangers. I wouldn't mess with them. But then another version of the song recorded by a different woman, she sings Hamo lenen asa vruach agus. Well, I can't remember exactly in Gaelic, but she basically says, my boyfriend's from Fraserburgh, and I wouldn't take up with a stranger. So it's like, sometimes men from Fraserburgh are strangers, sometimes they're not. I don't know if I explained that right, but basically it's really interesting. And you also get songs written in English by Gaelic-speaking women, which were meant to be circulated so that, because the man who had wronged her was an English speaker, if he ever heard it, he would understand what she was saying about him. It's called Stronsey Rocky Shores, and it's by this Gaelic-speaking herring gutter about how basically this two-timing lowlander got her into bed, and then she got pregnant, but now he's got a woman in every port. And she says at the end, oh, never trust a lowlander, nor on his oath rely. And that's how the song ends. So you do really get them interacting. It shows that they're interacting with not only people from other parts of the Gaeltacht. Women from Lewis were considered to be really influential on spreading this kind of music to women from other islands. So you got interaction between the different parts of the Gaeltacht, but also with the lowlands and the highlands. And I think that's interesting that these songs are kind of a linguistic preservation of that interaction.
That's very cool, because this multiculturalism, I've seen it before in Irish folk music.
Yeah.
I've actually seen it with Maureen Di Camble. Maureen is an Irish folklorist and singer songwriter, and she writes music in both Irish Gaelic and English, but sometimes she will write songs that mix both languages. Uh, basically much in the same way as the song you just sung to me, it, in a seemingly organic way, like automatically, without pausing, or without. It's almost as if sometimes it feels like it were basically they were the same language.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and organic is a good word for it, because that's exactly what this song is. Because, like I said, all of the verses here that have English in them were improvised, and because people would improvise songs about, like, kind of jokingly pairing up different fishermen with different gutters. And so it's like she's really just, they called this song in the ethnographic recordings her masterpiece. So obviously it stuck with her, and then she would repeat it the same as it had been when she was recording it for people. But you can tell in the moment, people must have just been thrilled with how funny it was that she was coming up with these verses as they were gutting. And what's interesting is that in the ethnographic recordings, they're often recordings, because she recorded this song a lot of times in the 50s primarily, and the 60s. And you can tell when there's a Gaelic speaking audience listening to the songs, they really laugh at the English words being thrown in. So it was considered kind of like a clever, funny thing. And so it's a sign of her kind of improvised wit that they're just thrown in there very naturally.
That's very, very interesting. Well, everything you're telling me is very interesting, because I am absolutely illiterate when it comes to Scottish to itinerant herring gutters work songs.
It is kind of a niche topic.
To a degree, because I've read some of your work, but since we're talking about this idea of multiculturalism and connections to other instances and places. And uh, this year would appear to have started along with other things that have occurred uh, with the sea shanty.
Mm.
Um, the sea shanty is everywhere. The sea shanty is being talked about, and it's being discussed about in almost every single social media, or so I'm told, because I don't have a lot of social media. Um, but over at Ask Historians, we are getting a lot of questions about them. You actually answered a question yesterday about the origin of the sea shanty.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask you that since there are a lot of misconceptions about sea shanties, and I don't wanna get into it right now particularly, but one of the biggest misconceptions that people seem to have is that every single sea shanty is a work song, and that every single work song sung aboard a ship was a sea shanty. And we know that's not the case. Um, but the sea shanty and the at least the cultural image that we have of the sea shanty is very much male dominated. Because what we see and what we know about the sea in general, particularly during the period when the sea shanty became popular, was very much male dominated. We're still talking about a time in which having a woman on board a ship was considered to be a bad omen in many cultures, particularly for the Spanish. For the Spanish and for Latin American sailors, it was a very, very big thing, believing that having a woman on board was dangerous and a terrible omen. And these work songs that you work on and that you are researching about, they are very much female dominated. So I wanted to ask you what are the largest differences that you find between the idea of the sea shanty and these work songs, especially when it comes to gender dynamics.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because on the one hand, in Scotland, particularly in lowland Scotland, more than the Highlands, you also had the superstition that it was extremely bad luck for women to be on board a ship. And I actually have seen that in action still today because we have a retired skipper in my village who works with the Fisheries Museum. And he's the skipper of the museum's heritage boat called the Reaper. And they have open days once a year, normally, not during pandemic times, where people can come and look on the boat. And it's open to the public, but three nuns wanted to come on, and he was just not having it. He said, "There will not be nuns on my ship." Like, because that combines the fear of women on the ship and the fear of clergy. He's like, "To have this open to the public, I'll let women on, but not nuns." And so, that
I draw the line at nuns.
yeah, exactly. And like he wouldn't, he was very superstitious. He wouldn't let oranges on the boat. You couldn't talk about pigs on the boat, all sorts of stuff. So Scottish sailors were very superstitious and did have a gender element to that. But getting back to the songs, it's interesting because, like you were saying, because the sea shanty is one of the most famous forms of work song, and it's certainly the most famous form of maritime work song. It can, for some people, lead to this perception that work song in 19th century maritime communities was like a really male thing. But what's interesting is that in the Gaelic work song tradition, work song is much more strongly associated with women. So for the Gaelic speaking women who were singing while gutting, it wouldn't have been weird to their sailor boyfriends that they were singing while they were working. It would have been like expected and normal. Because, like I said, you had the walking songs, which was a predominantly female activity. In some places, men weren't even allowed in while the women were walking, although that kind of varied from place to place. Lots of lullabies are considered part of the Gaelic work song tradition, which might seem kind of weird at first, but you are like doing like a rocking motion to get the baby to sleep, and they have a lot of vocables.
The rhythm is there.
Exactly. And that's a predominantly female thing, as well as milking and churning. You did have male Gaelic work songs as well, particularly rowing songs, although a lot of those, interestingly, are only preserved today because women adapted them into female work songs. Yeah. So in the Gaelic tradition, work songs are much more strongly associated with women. And the thing about comparing them to the sea shanties, There are a couple big differences aside from that. Like, for example, sea shanties, which I was talking about, and I've seen other flares talking about this on Ask Historians, they were really influenced by African work song traditions because you had a lot of black shantymen who would work on like these British shipping vessels. And when they'd come to the Caribbean and like the Gulf of Mexico, New Orleans, these kinds of places, there'd be loads of black river and sea workers who were influencing the music. And so sea shanties have this really kind of mixed international origin. They do have some things in common though, which across gender. So like one thing about sea shanties that we kind of associate as being a masculine thing is how like bawdy they are and kind of sexually explicit. But you actually get that a lot in the Gaelic women's gutting songs as well. Like a lot of it is kind of teasing, but like this song I sang for you, one of the lyrics had been transcribed in the 50s as being my lover has raised the red light. But a Gaelic singer, Margaret Stewart, was telling me the other day that actually she thinks it might have been the name of a type of crane. And so, like, my boyfriend's raising his crane kind of has a connotation. And you get like these kind of playful ones like, you know, I'll go down to this little beach on Lewis and I'll find 16 guys who want to be my lover. Like, they're pretty, this kind of confident. And some of them were probably, you know, since a lot of these were recorded in the 50s, some of them were probably considered kind of unprintable. All these, like, you know, kind of middle-aged Scottish guys coming to talk to these grannies in the Hebrides might not have sang them their dirtiest lyrics. But there is one line from a Scottish ethnographer who was really important, Hamish Henderson. He was one of the main movers and shakers of the foundation of the School of Scottish Studies in Edinburgh. So he was really the impetus behind a lot of this collecting of Gaelic music. And he compared one of the songs, he called it like the Ball of Kirriemoor. And when you look up the song, The Ball of Kirriemoor, it's like a graphic song about like an orgy. I'm like, oh my God, like he must know some lyrics that he didn't put down in the book because this seems really tame compared to that song. So I think that's something that they, you know, again, like I said, that's something we can kind of assume is like a masculine thing to sing dirty songs. But like these women were singing pretty dirty songs. Like there's this one that's actually not in Gaelic called I'm 94 This Morning. And the woman is singing basically, yeah, even though I'm 94, I'm getting married on Thursday. And then she says in one of the verses, there might be a christening yet before I'm 95. So basically expecting to get pregnant. And so it's like, you really have, and then, or like in the Isle of Man, they had this song about a woman who's getting married at 63 and doesn't know her way around a man at all and has no idea what she's in for. So you really do get a lot of bodiness in these songs. So and these are like from the 19th century, a lot of them, in the early 20th century. So, you know, we kind of have this image of like the prudish Victorian, but these are working class women, so that doesn't apply to them in the same way. And it really kind of deconstructs this idea of bodiness as like a masculine type of work song that wasn't polite for the ladies. It's like, oh, the ladies had their versions.
You know, that's very good to know because I find it particularly interesting what you mentioned about the lullaby being considered a work song, because when we look at these histories, and what you're saying about the deconstruction of the idea of the body and of sexuality in art and in music, there seems to be a certain protest element of sorts, or at least there is social commentary present. These women being able to talk about these things freely and openly, particularly during the Victorian era, which, like you said, we usually tend to consider the Victorian era an extremely repressive uh, and harsh time to live in most of the Western world, and also in most of the global South, particularly because the global South was very much still colonized during the Victorian era. Um, But the idea of the lullaby being considered work song, it's fascinating to me because nowadays we are still in the middle, especially here in Latin America, but in general in most of the world, we're still seeing a lot of feminist movements talking about this idea that for thousands of years, um, housework and taking care of children has been unremunerative work, that the women have been consistently paid nothing for doing these things that are work, that there are tasks, complicated tasks that take time, that take dedication, that take training. um, I think that this might be the first time in my life I've ever encountered the idea of a lullaby being considered a work song. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, there's definitely been Gaelic scholars who speculate that, and this is true for Irish music as well, because Irish work song does not survive as well as Scottish Gaelic work song, um, partially because of the famine. Um, And even when you did have emigration, Irish emigration tended to be to cities where you wouldn't sing agricultural labor songs anymore, whereas Scottish Gaelic emigration was mostly to rural Canada, so they could keep a lot more of those traditions alive. But in both Irish and Scottish Gaelic scholarship, there's kind of this sense of the lullaby. It was almost kind of the work song, that because you get these elements that show up in other work songs, like the nonsense vocables are so important in lullabies, and some lullabies almost entirely consist of them. And it makes sense because like they're kind of soothing sounds for a baby, like baba. Um, I think there's one in Gaelic that, yeah, a lot of baba, which makes sense because that's kind of how you do baby talk, like boop 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 boop, that kind of thing, you know. Um, so there is this kind of sense that they're really foundational, and it's even not just in the Gaelic stuff, the Irish and Gaelic, even in there's a sense that diddling, which is the kind of Scots version of mouth music, but it's like, you know, when I was doing the CO lady, that's diddling, but in Scots diddling, it's like the entire thing is diddled, and they call that lilting in Irish. And again, there it's like a form of dance music, which, as we've said, is related to work song. But they also connect it to dandling songs, and dandling is when you're kind of bouncing a baby on your knee and kind of like singing to entertain the baby. And it's really fascinating. I did a paper on this during my master's. Like, they would have diddling contests in rural Scotland in the 1930s, and they would have people sit on stage with a doll of a baby, and often men, which is an interesting gender thing because that was part of the comedy that it was a man doing it. But you would have women doing it too, and they'd bounce a doll up and down on their knees as part of the performance of diddling. And you get commentary from that time saying, like, you know, we kind of see this as like the origins of the tradition. So once again, it's this sense that like mothers singing to their children is really foundational to these dance and work traditions, because again, like we were saying, the rhythm is what soothes the baby. So it's like really important.
Yeah, the idea of a task being repeated over and over again, it works both in soothing the baby and it also in constructing a musical style. Okay, so another question I had for you, is you mentioned before the idea of internationalism and multiculturalism and different languages playing a part in the construction of these work songs. What can you tell us about the women singing work songs, that couldn't speak Gaelic?
So that's really good to bring up, because even though my research so far has focused primarily on Gaelic speakers, part of what I'm doing is for my PhD is trying to expand that to other language backgrounds of women who were involved in the fishing industry. Because you also had a lot of women who did not speak Gaelic at all, but worked the exact same job, and they would have been gutting the fish side by side with Gaelic speakers. And these women, like I mentioned, there were a few from Sweden and Norway, which is interesting, although I don't know anything yet about how their musical traditions might have factored in. But you also had women who spoke Irish, Manx Gaelic, which is related to Irish and Scottish Gaelic, English, and Scots. And for those who don't know, Scots is not it's not a good idea to just describe it as a dialect of English. It is recognized as a separate language, and it's the vernacular language of a lot of the east coast of Scotland. And you did have women from Scots, from all of these linguistic backgrounds, who would sing while they were gutting. So I mentioned earlier briefly the Manx Gaelic gutting song about the 60-year-old woman who had gotten married. That's something I'm really hoping, if we're allowed to travel this year, I have gotten funding to travel to the Isle of Man to research that some more. That would be really interesting. But then what there has been some work done on already is there's a woman at Aberdeen called Frances Wilkins, and she wrote a book called Singing the Gospel, which looked at the role of sacred song in these fishing communities in the northeast coast of Scotland and in the Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland. Even though it might be confusing Western Isles, Northern Isles, culturally they're very different. The Northern Isles were part of Norway until the 15th century or so, and they did not have Gaelic tradition at all. Basically there were two big evangelical revivals that really strongly hit fishing communities on the east coast of Scotland, one in the 1890s and one in 1921. And both of these coincided with really bad fishing years. So the fishing yields were really bad. That's, part of the story of anybody who's had to work in any fishing industry is from year to year, there's only so much you can do to control the catch. And so these communities were like really down. And there were these preachers traveling around Scotland, and they really hit a chord, to use a pun, with these communities, and they brought with them these American hymn books, the Moody and Sankey songbooks, and those kind of took these communities by storm. So in a place like Fraserburgh, there are these stories of after the men have come back from the fishing and there was like nothing, these people are just like dancing on the streets, singing hymns for so long, and it's such a frenzy that they pass out on the streets. And you have men start to sing hymns. They have certain hymns they sing when they're leaving the harbor, and then they have different hymns they sing when they come back into the harbor, based on whether it was a good catch or a bad catch. And so you also get the gutters start to sing hymns while they're gutting. And what's interesting is that before these revivals, they were probably singing songs in English and Scots that were very similar in content to the Gaelic songs. Because I gave a talk about this to my local community center, and there was an elderly gentleman in the audience who turned to the woman next to him after my talk and sang a little song. And then he said, I haven't thought of that since my mother sang it in the 30s. And I was like, what? So I went and interviewed him. It turned out he was my neighbor. And he sang me a little song. His name is Bill Motion. And he sang me a little song that his mother, who's from the east coast of Scotland, had improvised. And it was just like these other ones. It was to a Scottish dance tune, bon accord, and it went, "Div you see the KYs coming, div you see them coming new, div you see the KYs coming with Bonnie Jockey Murray on the boo." The KY boats were the local Kirkcaldy registered boats, and Jockey Murray was her best friend's boyfriend at the time, who they ended up getting married. And so she sang the song while gutting, teasing the other gutter like, "Oh, there's the local boats coming in and your boyfriend's like right on the bow." Boo is the Scots word for bow. And so there is that kind of hint there that like when they weren't singing hymns, the lyrics were really similar to the Gaelic songs. But in these communities where they started singing hymns, that kind of, I don't know, wiped out seems kind of harsh, but it really kind of covered over the other traditions. And there was this interview with a gutter, I think from Bucky, that the Bucky Heritage Society did in the 80s, where they were asking her about the music, and she's like, "Oh, they used to sing terrible, dirty songs before they got religion." And I was kind of like, I wish you had like recorded some of those songs, though. Like, I'd like to know what they were singing. So I do think there were a lot of similarities, but then once this evangelical revival hits, you do get a pretty big difference, because the Gaelic women were often extremely religious, but they would have considered it kind of inappropriate to sing religious songs during work. And they also came not from a hymn tradition, but from a psalm singing tradition. And I don't know if you've ever heard Gaelic psalm singing, but it's very non-rhythmically unified. Everybody's kind of singing it at like a different meter. So it really wouldn't have been suitable for work. But the women in the Northeast, in like Fraserburgh and Peterhead and places like that, they were singing hymns, and it's interesting. They usually picked ones with nautical themes. So like, will your anchor hold? I will make you fishers of men, Rock of Ages, that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm definitely interested in exploring more of that. I am also hoping to go to Shetland this year if it's possible, because they have a lot of interviews with herring gutters in their archives that are on cassette tapes, so you have to go there to listen to them. But so yeah, there's definitely a lot of interesting stuff still to be found out about non-Gaelic traditions as part of this musical cultural mix.
Well, this has been extremely educational. This has been great, so thank you very much. And would you like to sing us another song before we go?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. This has been really interesting. It's fun to talk about it, and I learned a lot about Argentinian folk music as well. I'll just sing. I won't go through this one afterwards, so I'll just end with this song. This is the one that apparently sometimes can be a really dirty song, but the lyrics I have do not hint at that. But it's about the main line is, the title is Runig as an Eicharasig, which means a star in a showery sky. And that's a Gaelic idiom meaning something extremely unlikely. So I'll just sing a couple verses of this one to end. Runig as an Eicharasig, runig as an Eicharoch, runig as an Eicharasig, hik molana ner mohod, yohalai, yohalo halai li. Rutna hakje dunje half, rutna hakje dunje bjau. Rutna hakje dunje half, maar ik gees aan voor yohalai, yohalo halai li. Saunen nu ik hannebalig, saunen nu ik hannesjoch. Saunen nu ik hannebalig, leken at me sambod, yohalai, yohalo halai li. Shimmick pintje jou melanin, shimmick pintje jou magrai. Shimmick pintje jou melanin, aan zijn royal kjane vai. Yo hello halai li.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.